Hello and welcome back. I hope you're all well. As we discussed free speech last week, I thought it would be a good idea to follow up with a discussion on political correctness. Political correctness has been one of the big punching bags in politics over the last 2 decades. If you're in Britain, during the last Labour government, you'd frequently hear complaints about PC culture. In the United States, you hear similar complaints from Republicans. This issue dovetails really well with free speech and how speech in society influences our politics. But before we can talk about political correctness, we have to talk about what political correctness is. Now, I'd like to give fair warning here. Many slurs of many different types will be mentioned, and I apologise in advance for their presence. So, political correctness. What is it? It's the idea that our use of language should be more sensitive and more understanding of the non-dominant group in society. A very dry and academic definition, but one that suits our purposes. To put it simply, you're not allowed to call someone black, coloured for example, or a brown person a coolie. The idea of political correctness is that casual racism, sexism, homophobia, misogyny, xenophobia, and so on are not things that we should accept within our society, especially not when we aim to build cosmopolitan, multi-ethnic and multicultural societies. After all, if you spend your entire life being called slurs, you are not going to feel very motivated to achieve in society or have any sense of community spirit. In the words of Malcolm X, we didn't land on Plymouth Rock. Plymouth Rock landed on us.
Our forefathers weren't the pilgrims. We didn't land on Plymouth Rock. The rock was landed on us.
As minorities have found their voices and are finding their opinions listened to, we're hearing more and more about what words are and are not acceptable. However, much of the drive around political correctness doesn't start with minorities. It begins with local councils, political bodies, and private companies attempting to preempt giving offence. There is a reason for this. As time has worn on, over the past 2 decades, much of the boomer population who react with the most vitriol to political correctness are beginning to be outmatched by the rising millennial and Gen Z population. This population tends to be avowedly liberal and very conscientious towards the struggle of minorities within European and American societies. In an attempt to stay popular and relevant, companies and politicians alike are jumping onto what they perceive as the next big cultural shift. This results in missteps, as companies often don't realise what is offensive and what isn't. For example, as a young child, Christmas time was Christmas time. You'd only ever hear it as the Christmas holes. As I've gotten older, whilst the vernacular hasn't shifted much, official organisations now refer to it as the winter holidays, often with Christmas-themed iconography but in a far more detached and less overtly Christian fashion. And every single year, despite nobody ever really caring about this, the far right jump up and down about Christmas being banned. This is a reflection of a secular state acting to slowly remove overt religious favourability. And pay attention to that. It's not about removing religion or religiosity as France does, it's about removing favourability towards one religion. This is an act by the government to try and make everyone feel welcome, as around that time of year there are a lot of religious festivals, from Christmas to Hanukkah to the festival of Sol Invictus. Another really good example of this is Disney feminism. Now, I'm an intersectional feminist. I wasn't always, but I've grown up. It often strikes me that the feminists I campaign with, the feminists I know, and the feminist literature I read often seeks to address very severe, very clear injustices within the framework of our society. Things like unequal marriage legislation, the right to choose whether to carry a child, the gender pay gap, harassment in and out of the workplace, the expectation of giving up a career for childcare, different legal standards for sexual assault. All very real, very systemic injustices that can, should, and will be fixed. When you talk to companies or view their marketing, however, you get a slightly different picture. Wouldn't it be nice to have a woman here or a woman there? It's why we get crap remakes of films, because the marketing is about sending a message, look how progressive we are, rather than let's address the systemic issues within the film industry that not only commodifies women but creates an unrealistic expectation around what a woman should be, what women's roles are in society, and normalising a culture of sexual objectification and assault. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that a symbol can't be helpful. You only need to see the joy in various black communities over having a black superhero in the Black Panther. A symbol can be immensely helpful, but it is a very fine line to tread. If you get it wrong, you do more damage than help, which is something Kathleen Kennedy and Disney Star Wars are sadly finding out. If the chief selling point of your film is that it has a female lead, all you're doing is setting up a film to fail. But I'll go into more detail in that elsewhere. The salient point here is that political correctness is often driven by those who do not want liberation or equal rights, but those who seek to profit from it, whether it be through votes or money. Is that to say political correctness is bad? No. Political correctness, when done correctly, is a good thing for us and for the societies in which we live. For most of Western Europe and the United States, rich, white, male aristocrats have been the dominant population in society for nearly 1,000 years. It's in the last 2 centuries that this expanded to white males, and it's only in the last 60 or so years that society has begun to equalise a little more for women, for ethnic minorities and foreigners. The growing pains we feel now is a reflection that our society is not set up for the people who do not fit the dominant hierarchy but are still of us regardless. Now, what do I mean when I say that? What I mean is that for most of the last century, a person who emigrated from the subcontinent or is a descendant from migrants from the subcontinent, that's India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Bhutan, Nepal and Sri Lanka, for you Americans, you were likely to face horrific abuse from the National Front and other sorts of jackbooted racists. You're also likely to face a horrific amount of casual racism, which is a lot harder to address. Political correctness seeks to address that casual racism by changing attitudes in society and walling off demeaning words, demeaning language and demeaning concepts unless that community itself attempts to reclaim a word, such as the various black communities in the US and the use of the N-word. It is no longer acceptable to refer to people who look like they may have subcontinent heritage as Pakis anymore. It is no longer acceptable to call people retards because they are dyslexic or are in other ways neuroatypical. This might seem like a small thing, but the language we use matters. It's like erosion. Saying it once might not hurt a person, but to constantly hear it over and over and over again wears at someone. And this is the thing, you might think that you're not doing any harm, but then so does everybody else. If every individual thinks that way and uses those words, that's no longer one instance, but hundreds, thousands, potentially millions. It's isolating, it's dehumanizing, and it takes a horrific toll on people's mental health. Another way political correctness seeks to improve everyone's experience of society is by attempting to cut out humour that punches down. This is a common misconception amongst opponents of political correctness, that it is trying to strip out jokes and remove humour entirely. This is simply not the case. What is attempting to be done is this. If a comedian is punching down at an already downtrodden community, then it's not really funny anymore. It's like a white comedian making jokes about black people being shot by the police in the US in a fashion that doesn't clearly show condemnation. With comedy, there's always a risk of normalising language that shouldn't be normalised, and sometimes it can age very, very badly. This leads me on to my next topic, the policing of language within the normal vernacular. There is a difference between professional standards and the language appropriate at work or in a professional atmosphere, and the more casual, dare I say more blunt language used between friends in the non-professional sphere. This has caused quite a bit of disconnect. Whilst political correctness in the professional sphere has leapt light years ahead of where it used to be, language use in the vernacular has not. It's why women still face horrific street harassment for the crime of walking down the street. It's why trans people are physically in danger if they don't pass or are outed. It's why in certain areas, being brown or Muslim is enough to make you demonstrably unsafe. People's filters haven't changed to reflect that. Part of it stems from age-old prejudices simply being stubborn and refusing to change. I've always called that Indian family across the street Pakis. It's affectionate. Why do I have to stop using it? Is the attitude that I have run into rather a lot. You see this sort of racism all the time, and it is racism despite the intent there being not intentionally racist. In a lot of areas, especially the non-metropolitan areas of countries, and I live in the north so maybe the accent gave it away, this sort of casual racism is rather common. Granted, it's an anecdote, but I've had more casual racism in the north and more derogatory racism in the south. Make of that what you will. The reason I'm bringing up this difference in how people's racism tends to be displayed is that political correctness is received differently by both. The derogatory racists know that it is wrong. They know exactly why those words hurt, but they simply do not care. These people aren't human, so throwing slurs at them and insulting them is fine. Political correctness coming down on these people is an undoubted social good. The more casual racists though, this is where it gets murky, and that's why there's such a backlash. These people, their racism isn't intentional. On the most part, they simply don't understand that what they're saying or the attitudes they hold are racist to begin with. To them, they're often not derogatory slurs, they're traditional words of endearment. You run into much the same issues with sexist insults and names. When political correctness hits these people, it does not invoke the reaction of, "Oh, I didn't realise," some modification followed by a frequent change. It invokes a reaction of upset and rage. "How dare you call me a racist?" Without realising they weren't being called racist, merely that the language they were using was itself racist, which is not the same thing in of itself. It's considered the normal done thing, and opposing that makes people ashamed and angry. Just look at the reaction to telling men that it isn't appropriate to wolf whistle or shout out "nice ass" at a woman as they walk past them in the street. Sure, we all saw Bugs Bunny wolf whistle as a kid, it's a thing, but out in the world, it's not a compliment, it's demeaning and harassment. Tell men who do it though, and they get very angry, because their upbringing has always been that it's a good thing, it's a sign of affection, not harassment, a visceral demonstration of the male gaze and sexualization. That gap there is the problem that political correctness runs into, and though the situation is slowly changing, we still need to find a way to connect the understanding that our society is changing and affectionate words and sentiments born of racism are still racism. Let's also not neglect right-wing political correctness. Oh, and it is political correctness, because what is it but an attempt at political correctness when certain jokes are off limits if targeted at conservatives? These noted free speech activists that complain endlessly if a leftist or liberal says that a joke punching down at minorities is not appropriate, yet those same people will seek to prevent any jokes that hit their sensibilities, be they Ronald Reagan or God, often the same person in their view, guns or Donald Trump, or even just something as banal as the US flag. Right-wing attempts at political correctness are inherently different from left-wing attempts at political correctness, and this isn't my bias here. If you examine the motives, it becomes pretty clear. For the most part, left-wing attempts are about giving minorities a voice so that they can define the terms they wish to be spoken to. Native American instead of Indian, African American instead of Negro, Pakistani instead of Paki. You get the gist. It's about lifting people up and creating a civil space in which they can join society without slurs and abuse. That is political correctness. Right-wing political correctness is about walling off topics from criticism or jokes, protecting that which should be up for debate and protesting against that which they find uncomfortable, such as comprehensive sexual education for teenagers. Ultimately, what we have to understand with political correctness is that whilst it may not always get things right, the aims are right. The idea that we should be multicultural, the idea that we should be open, free, fair and tolerant is right. The belief that we should do to the best of our abilities allow subcultures and minorities the ability to define themselves rather than imposing our labels upon them is right. I'll say it again for those at the back, a company doing political correctness isn't the same thing as left-wing political correctness. It's an attempt to try and use the cultural zeitgeist of our times to appear progressive, but that capitalist attempt to profit from progressivism doesn't undermine the utility of political correctness. So the next time someone complains about it, look deeper and ask, what is it they're really complaining about here? On that note, thank you for listening. I hope I'll see you next week where we'll talk about the United States of America. Thank you and goodbye.